The hum of the airport was a storm of motion and voices. Yet Hoa Karen walked as though she were moving through water, slow and deliberate, each step betraying no urgency. People brushed past her, wheeling glossy carry-ons, heels clacking on polished tile, suits pressed so sharp they looked like armor. She wore none of it. Her hoodie was faded navy, the cuffs frayed. Her jeans carried a tear at the knee, and her sneakers had long since surrendered their shine. In her hand, an old backpack swung with a quiet weight, its canvas army green and stitched with a patch of a weathered eagle nearly invisible unless someone looked for it. Nobody did. They saw only what they wanted, a girl who didn't belong. Boarding call announced. Oa moved with the line. Her eyes never wandered, never darted nervously like so many others. Instead, they stayed steady, as if she were counting each row number before it appeared. When she stepped into the cabin of the DC-bound flight, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. Laughter dulled. Eyes lifted. Judgments landed like stones. In business class, a woman in a sharp blazer with pearl earrings, Clara Voss, lifted her gaze from her phone and smirked, a quick up-and-down glance that carried the cruelty of habit. Beside her, Derek Cole, a corporate shark with silver cufflinks, leaned toward his neighbor and muttered just loud enough, "Looks like she took the wrong bus." His voice was smooth, practiced in boardrooms, but edged with amusement. The neighbor chuckled, not even bothering to disguise it. Hoa didn't flinch. Her footsteps stayed measured, her breathing even, her gaze fixed on the row numbers overhead. She had nothing to prove to them. Not here, not now. As she passed, Sophia Brandt, her black dress flawless, her hair arranged in soft waves designed for photographs, tilted her head with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You must be so excited to be flying like this," she said sweetly, her words dipped in condescension. A few passengers chuckled, catching the performance. Hoa stopped for a fraction of a second, one hand brushing the zipper of her backpack. Her eyes lifted to meet Sophia's just long enough. "It's just a flight," she said, her voice quiet but steady. A stone dropped into water. The ripple was immediate. Sophia's smile faltered, and she turned back in her seat, tossing her hair in annoyance. The aisle narrowed as Hoa approached row 14. Her seat, 14 farad, the window. She slid into it without hesitation, tucking her backpack beneath the seat ahead with care. The man beside her, mid-40s, expensive watch gleaming, gave her a quick once-over before returning to his tablet. His cologne was thick, his presence perfumed with money and superiority. His name tag clipped to his briefcase read, Ethan Harlow. He didn't bother with a hello. Hoa didn't offer one. The cabin buzzed with that particular kind of energy, born from people who believe themselves above others. Complimentary drinks clinked. Laughter was sharp and assured, and the hierarchy was unspoken yet palpable. Hoa leaned back, her face bare of makeup, her hair tied loosely behind her. She looked like she could have been a college kid chasing cheap tickets, scraping by. That was what they saw. What they didn't see was written nowhere. They could look the files sealed in classified archives, the call sign whispered in locked briefings. Phantom Eagle. Outside the window, the Seattle tarmac blurred with motion. Inside, whispers trailed behind her like smoke. But Hoa Karen's fingers stayed steady as they rested on her lap, calloused hands folding with the precision of someone who had weathered storms others couldn't even name. To the cabin, she was just another passenger, dressed wrong, seated wrong, a misplaced piece in their curated puzzle. To herself, she was exactly where she needed to be. The plane had not yet moved, but already the first battle lines had been drawn. The cabin had barely settled when the first strike came. Miranda Hale, the head flight attendant, appeared at the front like a stage performer stepping into her role. Her uniform was crisp, her smile polished, but her eyes had the sharpness of someone who measured people in seconds and decided their worth just as quickly. When she reached row 14, her gaze flicked over Hoa Karen, down to the hoodie sleeves hiding her wrists, then back to the gleaming watches and blazers around her. Economy passengers usually sit in the back, Miranda remarked smoothly, her tone laced with disdain, loud enough for those nearby to hear. But today's flight is full, so... She let the words dangle, a deliberate insult wrapped in a professional smile. Several business-class passengers chuckled. Ethan Harlow smirked over the edge of his tablet, shaking his head slightly, as if to say the universe had made a clerical error letting someone like her into this cabin. Clara Voss raised her glass, adding, "Well, it must be her lucky day." Hoa didn't answer. She simply adjusted the strap of her backpack at her feet, slow and precise, her movements too deliberate to be mistaken for nervousness. The pressure didn't stop there. When the meal service began, Miranda's performance sharpened. She carried a tray of glossy menus and leaned toward Derek Cole first, her voice a touch warmer. "Here you go, sir. Our premium selection." She repeated the gesture for Clara, for Sophia, even for Ethan, each smile sweeter, each tone softer. Then she looked past Hoa entirely, turning her shoulder deliberately. "I'm sorry," she said loudly, her voice pitched to carry down the aisle. "We only have enough for premium passengers." The jab landed. Laughter rippled again, sharp as broken glass. A man in a tailored navy blazer 2 rows ahead turned to his companion, his words a stage whisper. "Don't worry. She's probably used to fast food." Hoa's hands stilled on the armrest. She lifted her eyes just enough to meet Miranda's. "Water's fine," she said softly, but with a firmness that was impossible to dismiss. Her voice was low, measured, and final, like a line drawn in the sand. "For a beat," Miranda faltered. Then her heels clicked briskly as she moved away, her perfect smile tightening at the edges. The others didn't relent. Sophia Brandt leaned closer from behind, her perfume sharp as she whispered to her friend, "She's shaking. Bet she's terrified being near the emergency exit." Her friend stifled a laugh. "Imagine if she had to open the door. We'd all be doomed." The words floated like poison, feeding the growing fire of ridicule. Ethan chuckled, adding, without looking up from his screen, "She's out of her depth, that's for sure." Hoa didn't turn. She twisted the cap of her water bottle slowly, the plastic creasing under her grip. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, so small it looked almost imagined. But her eyes stayed on the window, scanning the sky as though she were watching for something no one else could see. Hours stretched into a rhythm of clinking glasses and murmured conversations, but the undercurrent of judgment never left. Every glance, every half-laugh, was another stone tossed at her silence. Finally, Derek Cole shifted in his seat, eager to break the quiet. "You look like you're headed to a job interview or something," he said, his voice dripping condescension. "Hope you've got a better outfit in that bag." Hoa turned her head just enough for her eyes to meet his. They were dark, calm, unreadable, like deep water with no bottom. "I'm good," she replied, her voice low, almost too quiet to hear, but sharp as steel, sliding into place. Derek blinked, unsettled. His smirk faltered, and he muttered something about kids these days, retreating back to his tablet. The small defeat rippled through the rows, but the current of mockery did not entirely vanish. From across the aisle, Clara tilted her head toward Sophia, whispering, "Imagine being so out of place you don't even realize it." Sophia laughed, flipping her hair. Some people just don't know their lane. The laughter that followed was softer this time, but it carried, needling in its persistence. Hoa leaned back in her seat, her fingers tapping once against the armrest, a controlled, grounding motion. She said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence could cut deeper than retorts. The engine's steady hum filled the cabin, masking her heartbeat, steady and unbroken. To them, she was still the outsider in 14 Farad, ordinary, misplaced, invisible except as the butt of a joke. What they didn't know was that every word, every smirk, every attempt to diminish her was only sharpening the knife of what was to come. The storm had not yet broken, but the air inside the cabin was already tightening, thick with the arrogance of those who thought they knew who she was. Hoa Karen simply waited, her gaze steady on the horizon. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, slicing through the drone of the engines. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be making a short refueling stop at Raven Rock Air Base. Please remain seated unless instructed otherwise." The words were ordinary enough, but the effect inside the cabin was immediate. Business-class passengers straightened in their seats, adjusting watches, smoothing jackets, checking phones as though about to step into a boardroom. Their anticipation hung thick in the air. For them, Raven Rock meant novelty, an anecdote to brag about at dinner parties. We stopped on a military base once, saw the jets up close. Hoa Karen felt the shift. Her posture straightened subtly, her eyes narrowing toward the window. Out on the horizon, faint shapes shimmered in the sunlight sleek. Silver forms of F-22 Raptors lined along the tarmac, wings like blades cutting into the blue. Personnel moved with precise choreography, their steps sharp, their gestures deliberate. The sight pulled something inside her taut, like a wire vibrating against memory. Miranda Hale, always alert for a chance to perform, seized the moment. She picked up the intercom with a smile so tight it could cut glass. A select group of passengers will be invited to disembark and meet the F-22 pilots during our brief stop, she announced, her eyes sweeping the cabin, pausing deliberately on Derek, Clara, Sophia, Ethan, faces glowing with smug expectation. Then she glanced at Hoa, her smile sharpening with cruelty. Others, of course, will remain seated. The message was clear: know your place. Snickers rose in small ripples. Clara leaned toward Sophia, whispering, they definitely won't be taking pictures with her. Sophia laughed softly, hiding it behind her manicured hand. Ethan smirked, murmuring, can you imagine? Hoodies and combat jets don't exactly mix. Hoa didn't move. She didn't even blink. Her hand rested on her backpack strap, thumb brushing once against the faded eagle patch, then stilling again. The plane touched down with a shudder, tires screeching against concrete. Sunlight spilled through the windows, catching the silver edges of the Raptors. The air inside the cabin tightened, every sound sharper, every motion amplified. Then the door opened. A man stepped in. He wore a dark blue uniform that carried the weight of command without needing words. Commander Marcus Steele, late 30s, jaw set like stone, eyes that missed nothing. His presence was like a storm entering a quiet room, electrifying, impossible to ignore. Conversation in business class cut off mid-sentence. Even Miranda's professional smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. Commander Steele, Miranda greeted, voice pitched high, offering him the same polished smile she reserved for CEOs. Welcome aboard. We have several premium passengers eager to meet you. Steele gave her a curt nod, already scanning the rows. He shook Derek's hand, accepted Clara's practice greeting, nodded politely at Sophia. His movements were efficient, polite, but detached formalities without attachment. And then his gaze landed on row 14, on Hoa Karen. For a moment, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Steele froze mid-handshake with Clara, his eyes locking onto Hoa as though the rest of the room had evaporated. His jaw tightened, his posture shifting from courtesy to something heavier, reverent. He stepped forward, each booted stride echoing against the cabin floor, cutting through the murmurs like a drumbeat. When he stopped at row 14, the silence was complete. Are you... His voice dropped lower, rough with disbelief. Are you Phantom Eagle? A ripple moved through the cabin. Derek scoffed audibly, laughter bubbling in his throat as though the very idea was absurd. Clara frowned, confused. Sophia whispered sharply, what did he say? Hoa lifted her head slowly. Her gaze met Steele's with steady calm, no flicker of surprise, no hesitation. She gave the smallest of nods. Steele straightened, his expression hardening into something that silenced even Derek's scoff. When he spoke again, his voice carried for the entire cabin to hear. My apologies, he said firmly, his tone commanding. You shouldn't have been seated here. You're requested on the tarmac immediately. The words detonated like a bomb. For a split second, disbelief crackled through the cabin. Ethan snorted, trying to smother his nervous laugh. This must be some mistake, he said, voice pitched high with forced amusement. She doesn't look like anyone important. But Steele didn't so much as glance at him. His eyes stayed locked on Hoa. Hoa rose slowly, fluidly, as though every motion had been rehearsed 100 times before. She swung her backpack onto one shoulder, fingers tightening briefly on the strap. The helmet patch flashed in the light for a moment before it was hidden again. She moved with precision, no wasted movement, no hesitation. Whispers ignited around her. Clara leaned into Derek. This has to be a joke. Sophia fumbled for her phone, desperate to record. Ethan shook his head, muttering, publicity stunt, that's all. But their voices were small now, thin against the weight in the air. As Hoa followed Commander Steele down the aisle, a man in a navy suit with a glossy watch leaned out of his seat, desperation and arrogance colliding in his voice. "Wait, this is ridiculous. She doesn't belong out there. She's nobody." Hoa paused mid-step. Slowly, she turned her head, her gaze slicing through him like a blade through silk. Her voice was calm, soft, but it carried to every corner of the cabin. "Looks can be deceiving." The man faltered, his mouth snapping shut. The silence that followed was thicker than before, heavy with the realization that none of them knew who she was or what she had done. Commander Steele's eyes flicked toward the man, a silent warning, before he motioned Hoa forward. She walked steadily, her hoodie flapping lightly with the draft from the open door. And as she stepped out onto the tarmac, the world of business-class mockery and petty disdain fell away behind her. What waited outside was something else entirely. The turning point had arrived. The first thing that hit Hoa Karen as she stepped out of the cabin was the air sharp, metallic, filled with jet fuel and the low thunder of engines idling in formation. The sunlight was merciless, catching the polished edges of the Raptors lined across the runway like silent predators. The wind tugged at her hoodie, snapping the fabric against her sides. She walked forward, each step precise, her backpack balanced against one shoulder. Behind her, the cabin windows were crowded with faces pressed to the glass, their earlier laughter now replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. On the tarmac, a line of F-22 pilots stood at rigid attention. Their uniforms were immaculate, boots polished, visors reflecting the sky. The sight was almost ceremonial, a wall of discipline and respect. Commander Marcus Steele halted, turned sharply, and raised his voice so the cabin could hear through the open hatch. "Attention!" The pilots snapped in unison, their hands rising in perfect salute. The sound of boots striking concrete echoed like a drumbeat. Steele's voice carried, low but fierce. "This is Phantom Eagle, the pilot who once led 3 squadrons through enemy skies and brought them home alive." The words rolled across the tarmac like thunder. In the cabin, murmurs broke into audible gasps. Sophia's phone slipped from her hand onto her lap. Derek leaned forward, his smirk gone, his face pale. Miranda Hale, frozen by the galley door, clutched the frame as though it could steady her. Hoa stopped in front of the line of pilots. For a moment, silence reigned, broken only by the low hum of the jets. Her eyes moved slowly across the faces, seeing not just uniforms but memories echoes of missions cloaked in darkness. Skies split with tracer fire, decisions made in the span of a breath. Commander Steele stepped aside, and another figure approached a young pilot, his face still boyish under the cap, his hands trembling slightly as he held something out. An old flight helmet, worn smooth from use, its black surface etched with a single name stitched across the side. Phantom Eagle. "This belongs to you," Steele said, his voice steady, but his eyes betrayed something else, admiration, almost reverence. Hoa reached out slowly, her fingers brushing the helmet. For a heartbeat, her reflection stared back at her in the visor. Older now, scarred in ways no one could see. She lifted it with the same precision she had carried her entire life, cradling it against her chest like a relic. A murmur rippled among the pilots. One of them, barely out of his 20s, stepped forward, his voice cracking as he spoke. She's the one who saved my squadron. We wouldn't be here without her." Another pulled out a small weathered logbook, its corners frayed from years of use. He flipped to a page marked with a careful fold and held it up. "Ma'am, you signed this for me 3 years ago." There, written in firm, deliberate strokes, was her call sign. Phantom Eagle. The pilot's eyes shifted, their rigid professionalism softening into awe. They knew her not as the hoodie-wearing stranger the cabin had mocked, but as a living legend whose name had traveled through their training like a whispered myth. Hoa slipped the helmet under her arm and raised her hand. Her salute was sharp, crisp, precise. The line of pilots responded instantly, their movements synchronized, reverberating with respect. For the first time that day, a faint smile touched her lips, subtle but unmistakable. The wind carried the moment, sweeping across the runway and into the cabin windows where passengers stared, stunned into silence. No one laughed now. No one whispered. They could only watch as the woman they had dismissed returned the salute of warriors who owed her their lives. Commander Steele's voice broke the silence again, louder now, directed toward the gawking passengers. Never forget what you see here. Not all heroes look the way you expect. Inside the plane, Clara pressed a hand to her chest, her earrings forgotten. Derek stared blankly, his earlier arrogance collapsing into confusion. Sophia fumbled to unlock her phone again, but her hands shook too much to hold it steady. Miranda Hale's lips parted, but no words came. Hoa lowered her salute, adjusted the helmet under her arm, and glanced briefly back at the cabin. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes carried a weight no mockery could ever touch. For her, the respect of these pilots mattered more than the approval of strangers. And now, the truth stood in plain view. The outsider in seat 14 Farad was the Phantom Eagle. The revelation was complete. When Hoa Karen stepped back into the cabin, the air felt entirely different. She still wore the faded hoodie, her sneakers still scuffed, her backpack still patched with the Eagle insignia, but now the helmet rested under her arm, a black and gray relic that carried more authority than any tailored suit or gold cufflink. The passengers who had once snickered now stared at her in uneasy silence. Some eyes held curiosity, others disbelief. A few the brittle skepticism of people who refused to admit they had been wrong. Miranda Hale forced a bright smile, but her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her uniform apron. Derek Cole shifted in his seat, muttering to Clara, "It's probably just ceremonial. PR stunt, nothing more." Clara nodded too quickly, as though to convince herself. Hoa said nothing. She slid back into seat 14 Farad, setting the helmet carefully on her lap, her fingers brushing the edge of the visor with the tenderness of memory. The engines roared back to life as the plane prepared to leave Raven Rock. Outside, the Raptors gleamed like silver sentinels, their wings catching the afternoon sun. Inside, the tension was thick, a silence weighted by shame and denial. As the aircraft rolled toward the runway, Hoa's eyes remained on the window. Her breathing was even, but her posture was different now, straighter, heavier, with the knowledge that the cabin no longer saw just a stranger. They saw a question, a riddle they could not solve. Moments later, the plane lifted, the wheels leaving the ground, the horizon tilting beneath them. The familiar hum filled the cabin once again. Passengers began to murmur, testing their voices against the silence, but every glance toward Hoa stuttered, hesitant. Then it happened. A low, powerful roar tore across the sky. Shadows flashed against the cabin windows. Gasps spread like wildfire as two F-22 Second appeared, sleek and predatory, flying parallel to the commercial jet. Their wings cut the sunlight into blades of silver and shadow. The cabin erupted in stunned voices. Phones lifted. Clara pressed her hands against the glass, whispering, "They're flying with us." Sophia fumbled to record, her influencer's grin shaky and unconvincing. Derek muttered, "It's just for show. That's all. Just for show." But his voice wavered. Then came the voice deep, unmistakable, carried through the cabin speakers on a private frequency patched into the cockpit. "Phantom Eagle." Commander Marcus Steele's tone was steady, reverberating with authority. "Formation. Ready for escort." Every conversation died. The cabin froze. Miranda Hale, midway through adjusting a tray, dropped it with a clatter, metal and plastic, scattering across the aisle. Ethan Harlow's tablet slipped from his hands, forgotten. Hoa's expression didn't change. She reached for the small headset handed to her earlier, slid it over her ear, and pressed the comm switch. Her voice, calm and commanding, filled the silence. "Hold formation, Talon 1. The response was instant, sharp, and unified. "Yes, ma'am." The Raptors shifted, their formation tightening seamlessly, their wingtips gleaming only yards from the cabin windows. The precision was breathtaking, terrifying in its closeness, awe-inspiring in its control. Passengers pressed to the glass, their fear bleeding into astonishment. Hoa leaned back in her seat, her fingers tapping once against the helmet in her lap, a rhythm steady, controlled. Her eyes never left the jets outside, but the faintest curve touched her lips, the quietest hint of a smile. In business class, Derek Cole sat rigid. His earlier bravado evaporated. Clara clasped her hands together tightly, her diamond earrings forgotten. Sophia's phone trembled in her grip, the recording jerky, unfocused. Miranda stood frozen near the galley, her professional mask shattered. No one dared speak now. The escort continued. The Raptors locked in perfect synchrony beside the passenger jet, a silent declaration for all to see. This was not theater, this was loyalty. This was respect owed and returned. Minutes stretched, the sky vast and endless, yet the cabin felt smaller than ever, compressed by the gravity of realization. Each passenger replayed their earlier words, their mockery, their careless cruelty, now stripped bare against the truth unfolding outside the window. Finally, Hoa spoke again, her voice steady over the channel, audible in the cabin. Maintain position until altitude stabilizes, then brake left on my mark. Her tone carried no doubt, no hesitation. It was the voice of command, honed in missions the passengers could not imagine, sharpened in nights where survival balanced on seconds. Copy that, came the reply, firm and absolute. For the passengers, the truth was undeniable now. She was no charity case, no misplaced girl in a hoodie. She was Phantom Eagle, and the sky itself bore witness. The Raptors held formation, their engines roaring like distant thunder, until Hoa gave her final order. Mark. In perfect unison, the fighters peeled away, banking into the sunlight, leaving contrails that carved sharp lines across the sky. The cabin remained silent long after. Hoa set the headset aside, her hand resting once more on the helmet in her lap. She turned back to the window, her gaze softening as the contrails dissolved into the blue. The storm had reached its peak, and now the silence that followed was heavier than any mockery had ever been. The descent into Washington began with a hush that was heavier than any turbulence. The hum of the engines filled the void, but the usual chatter, the drinks orders, the clicking of tablets, the casual laughter was gone. The cabin felt suspended in something denser than air, the weight of collective recognition. Hoa Karen sat in 14 Farad, her hoodie still pulled low, her sneakers still worn, the helmet resting silently against her lap. Nothing about her outward appearance had changed, yet every pair of eyes that drifted toward her now carried the same question, the same disbelief, the same uneasy reverence. Derek Cole shifted uncomfortably, his cufflinks gleaming as though mocking him. He cleared his throat once, then again, as though trying to summon words, but none came. Clara Voss sat with her hands folded tightly, her nails digging into her palms. Sophia Brandt, who had so confidently staged her whispered mockery, now fumbled with her phone, scrolling through screens without seeing them. Ethan Harlow stared at the floor, his Rolex still flashing in the cabin light but his confidence extinguished. The plane's nose dipped slightly as the skyline of Washington, D.C. slid into view, monuments catching the orange glow of late afternoon sun. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady but distant. Cabin crew, prepare for landing. Hoa adjusted the strap of her backpack, calm as stone. Her fingers brushed the eagle patch for a moment before returning to the helmet, grounding herself with that quiet rhythm. She hadn't asked for the attention, hadn't sought the moment that now suffocated the others, but she also wasn't going to shrink from it. When the wheels struck the runway with a solid thud, no one clapped. The silence held. The aircraft taxied slowly, rolling past other jets, the world outside going on as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But inside, the weight of unspoken shame pressed on every chest. As soon as the seatbelt light blinked off, Derek rose too quickly, his voice loud, brittle. I didn't know who you were, he stammered, his words rushing to fill the silence. Heads turned instantly toward him. I'm sorry for what I said earlier. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. His apology hung awkwardly in the air. Hoa looked up, her gaze steady but not cruel. She gave a single nod, neither absolution nor condemnation. Just acknowledgement. Derek swallowed hard, his face flushed, and retreated into his seat. Others followed in quieter ways. Clara avoided Hoa's eyes completely, pretending to check her bag. Sophia opened her phone's camera again, but her hands shook. The once polished confidence of an influencer reduced to tremors. Miranda Hale stood at the exit, her smile brittle, her fingers clenched around the safety manual, as though it could anchor her back into control. Hoa rose with no hurry, slinging her backpack over one shoulder, tucking the helmet securely under her arm. She walked down the aisle without pausing, her steps soft but unyielding, sneakers whispering against the carpet. She didn't look left or right, didn't meet the darting eyes or the fidgeting hands. She moved like someone who had nothing to prove, and by that very truth, proved everything. At the gate, the air shifted again. Waiting there was a tall man in a simple, tailored suit. His presence was quiet but commanding, a kind of gravity that turned heads without demanding to. Adrian Monroe. His eyes locked onto Hoa the moment she emerged. He didn't smile broadly, didn't rush forward. He simply nodded once, falling into step beside her with a kind of ease that came from deep understanding. The passengers who lingered at baggage claim recognized him instantly, their murmurs cut short, their gazes widening as the puzzle sharpened. Ethan Harlow dropped his phone mid-text. Clara tugged at her scarf, suddenly unable to meet anyone's eyes. Miranda busied herself furiously with paperwork, her movements jerky, betraying nerves. Then, from the crowd, a small voice pierced the tension. A girl, no older than 10, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Is that the pilot lady?" she whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. Her mother, a quiet woman who had stayed silent the entire flight, looked at Hoa for a long moment. Then she nodded gently. "Yes, that's her." The child's face lit with awe. Hoa caught the girl's gaze and offered the smallest of smiles, warm and genuine, the kind that said, "I see you." The girl grinned back, clutching her mother's hand tighter, as if holding onto a secret treasure. Hoa and Adrian walked on, side by side, their steps unhurried, the helmet under her arm gleaming faintly under the terminal lights. People parted without thinking, giving them space, as though instinctively recognizing a weight they couldn't define. For the passengers, the tables had turned. What began as mockery ended in silence. What began as judgment ended in awe. They had measured her against the wrong scale and found themselves wanting. Hoa Karen didn't look back. She didn't need to. By the next morning, the ripples had already begun. What happened on that flight did not stay in the sealed cabin. Phones had been raised, videos captured, whispers uploaded before the wheels even touched DC soil. And once released, the truth moved like fire through dry grass. The first casualty was Derek Cole. His voice, smug and dripping with disdain, had been caught clearly in the recording. "Hope you've got a better outfit in that bag." The video cut sharply to the same man standing red-faced, stammering an apology as Hoa Karen walked past him in silence. By dawn, it was everywhere: news feeds, social networks, even boardroom chat groups. By noon, Derek's company had issued a terse statement: "Mr. Cole is no longer with us." His LinkedIn profile vanished soon after, his name scrubbed from websites that once displayed him proudly. Clara Voss fared little better. Her smirking whispers, once meant only for Sophia, were amplified for millions. Her prestigious law firm distanced itself immediately, issuing a public apology for the conduct of an associate not reflective of our values. By the week's end, Clara found herself reassigned to menial casework, her climb to partnership shattered. Sophia Brandt, who had built an empire on curated perfection, saw her foundation crumble overnight. Her followers dropped by the thousands, sponsors canceled contracts, and her carefully filtered photos were buried beneath comments that cut sharper than any insult she had dealt out. "Some role model you are." She tried an apology video, tearful and dramatic, but the internet was not forgiving. The smirk she'd worn on that flight was replayed endlessly beside the salute of F-22 pilots, and the contrast destroyed her. Ethan Harlow's downfall came quieter, but no less final. One of his investors happened to be a former Air Force officer. When the video reached him, the disgust was immediate. Funding was pulled. Ethan's startup collapsed within weeks, the bold promises of disruption drowned in silence. And Miranda Hale, the flight attendant who had wielded authority like a knife, was summoned by her airline's board. The reprimand was swift, the reassignment decisive. Gone were her dreams of international routes and first-class cabins. She now worked short-haul flights, crisscrossing domestic skies, each trip a reminder of the day she had misjudged a passenger who carried more honor in silence than she had in uniform. The reckoning was not thunderous. It was quiet, relentless, inevitable. Each person who had laughed, sneered, dismissed, found the weight of their words returned to them not by Hoa's hand, but by the world that had watched and judged in turn. And Hoa Karen? She remained untouched by the storm. She didn't need to scroll the headlines or watch the clips. She had lived through fire and sky, through missions where the wrong decision cost lives. To her, The jeers of strangers were just noise, the kind she had long ago learned to tune out. That night, she stood with Adrian Monroe on a rooftop in D.C., the city lights flickering below them like stars scattered across Earth. The helmet rested beside her, the eagle patch on her backpack glinting faintly. Adrian said little, he never needed to. His presence was enough, steady and grounding. "You didn't even look at them," he murmured finally. "Not once." Hoa's gaze stayed on the horizon. "Because it wasn't about them," she said softly. "It never was." For a moment, silence wrapped around them, broken only by the hum of the city. Then she added, almost to herself, "I've flown through skies on fire. I've seen what real fear looks like. This?" She exhaled slowly. This was just a reminder. The reminder was clear. Not all battles are fought with weapons. Some are fought with silence, with patience, with the unshakable certainty of who you are. Days later, when the noise of consequences began to fade, a letter arrived at the base. It was from a young girl, the one who had tugged her mother's sleeve in the terminal. The handwriting was messy, uneven. "Dear pilot lady, I want to be brave like you. Thank you for smiling at me." Hoa read it once, folded it carefully, and tucked it into the logbook she still kept. For her, that was enough. The world had doubted her, mocked her, tried to make her small. But she had never been small. She had been Phantom Eagle, even when no one was watching. And for every soul who had ever been overlooked, ridiculed, or silenced, her story was more than legend. It was a quiet promise. You are not small. You never were. And you are never alone. The story of Hoa Karen is not just about a flight or a confrontation between arrogance and truth. It is about the countless moments in life when we are underestimated, when the world looks at us and decides without knowing us that we are less. We all know what it feels like to be judged by appearances, dismissed by strangers, or quietly mocked by people who believe they are above us. In those moments, it is tempting to fight back with anger, to prove ourselves with loud words. But true strength rarely needs to shout. Hoa Karen's silence was never weakness. It was discipline, forged through battles most people will never see. Her calm was not indifference, but a choice, the choice to let truth reveal itself in time. When the Raptors formed beside her plane, when the salute snapped across the runway, when respect came not from words but from deeds, every sneer and smirk collapsed under its own emptiness. The message is clear. Never let the world tell you that you are small. Titles, clothing, wealth, appearances, these are shallow measures. Real worth is carried in actions, in resilience, in the quiet knowledge of who you are. Respect is not something you beg for, nor something you purchase. It is something you live every day until it cannot be denied. For those who have been overlooked or belittled, remember this. You are not defined by the voices that doubt you. You are defined by the strength you carry in silence, by the battles you have already survived, by the courage to keep moving forward even when no one sees. You are not small. You never were. And you are never alone.